Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Now we're going to talk about the making of the movie. I'm going to bring out our panelist, art critic, and author of Rebels in Paradise, Hunter Drohoyovska. Phil. Got it? Preparator on the Duchamp Show and curator Hal Glicksman. Designer and therapist Eve Babitz. And producer and director David Grabias. We will chat for 20 or so minutes, and then we'll have time for some audience questions. Keep your phones quiet so we don't pick up any chirping as we're recording. David, I'm going to start with you. And I'd like to start with a question that is true for narrative film, and not a lot of people think about it for nonfiction film, and that is who's going to star in your movie. Because you cast documentaries just like you cast narrative films. And I'm wondering, when you were thinking about casting your documentary, what were you looking for, and how did you end up with some of the people who are on the stage tonight?
Sure. Well, I mean, how can I say? I mean, it happened a long time ago. So breathing, being alive was, I think, very important. And I mean that as a compliment to the folks next to me here. And I was really pleasantly surprised when we started the research for the project. It so happened by chance that Hal Glicksman, there was actually a show of pieces from his own personal collection, which I happened to see, which was a great little show. And when I saw that, I got really excited that he was around and still active. Our producer Liz Newman, who's here, did a incredible work and managed to actually track down Mirandi and introduced her, the project to her and got her to agree to come on. And and then Hunter, she wrote the book.
Yeah.
So I mean, literally, in terms of finding someone who could be our in-house expert, subject expert, she was the obvious choice. But I think obviously we wanted to speak to as many artists who had been there as possible. Obviously people like Mirandi who had been there as guests. And then a lot of it also was just trying to find archival material from Marcel Duchamp himself, and then from Walter Hopps and other folks, Dennis Hopper for that matter, who had also been present. So to make them feel like they were, there was a conversation amongst all of them. So, in a lot of ways, we were very lucky to be able to find as many people who had been there and attended. And that there's the great footage of Marcel Duchamp. He's driving around Los Angeles being interviewed by a French film crew, and it's the only time that we could find where he actually talks about the Pasadena exhibition and his trips here. And when I saw that, I knew, okay, we got something. So
this is a question for Hunter, Hal, and Mirandi, and that is, in working in the making of this film, talking about the show, and then watching the film itself, did it bring back memories that maybe you'd forgotten? Did you have some sort of revisiting of what that moment felt like, and what was it like to actually watch the film? And did it take you back to that show and rekindle some memories?
It really took me back on one thing that, my sister Eve, wrote a piece about it that was a very famous piece called "I Was a Naked Pawn for Art." And so, I was rereading it before I did the interview so that I could kind of really remember, myself at that time, her at that time, So, yeah, brought back a lot.
How?
Well, it was really a pleasure to remember all of those scenes with Walter. It just, you say something to somebody, and then a week later you remember all these things. It stirs up the memories, and they rise to the surface. And I really like how you cut me in on all those scenes. That was very nice.
And I will say, I mean, both of you and the other folks, the artists, Ed Ruscha, other people that we talked to, it wasn't as if we had to remind them
Right.
that this had happened.
Yeah.
You know, we would contact them and say, "Hey, we're doing this project that's focused on this Duchamp exhibition in Pasadena." And they're like, "Oh yeah," you know. So I think, I mean, it struck me again the kind of the seminal nature of the event. It clearly was a seminal experience for all these people, both personally and professionally, which is not always the case with something that happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
And Hunter, what about you watching all this archival footage?
Well, it's terrific to see all that because my book was came out in 2011, so I wrote it the previous sort of 6 years. But it reminded me of tracking down all these people, and I was so lucky to get to many of these people while we still had them, and we just lost Eve last year. But I'm still struck after all this time about the complete improbability of Marcel Duchamp doing a retrospective at the Pasadena Art Museum. And the idea of calling someone up at 11 o'clock at night and saying, "Come on over, we're hanging this show." And, you know, and Hal thinking, "Well, there's nothing to work with here. We'll just cover these panels in green baize because it looks like it'll remind us of you know, game boards." I mean, it was so loose. And can we just pause for a moment and realize that they did that in 1 year? Hello? They did the show in 1 year. Okay, so they managed to do a whole Marcel Duchamp retrospective in 1 year. And I think the total budget was $24,000. So museum officials everywhere, heads up.
I'm going to ask you, David, also about the logistics of making a movie that features visual art. And there are rules for licensing art in a film. On top of that, you have to deal with, I assume, the Andy Warhol estate, which certainly can age people very fast. So I'm wondering, in terms of licensing and the estate and archival footage, what were the challenges that were unique to this project?
Yes. Well, and again, I have to credit Liz, who I mentioned before, our producer, and then Marley Lister, who I think is here, who was our partner in crime on the KCET side. But it was a complicated process for sure. When you make when you write a book or you make a movie, anything where you are using depictions of someone's artwork, you have to license their artwork from either the artist if they're alive, or if they are deceased, there's a thing called the Artists' Rights Society, which, and you can imagine, Marcel Duchamp does not come cheap. So first we had to clear usage of his likeness and his artwork. Then you have to go find the actual clips and license them separately from BBC or from whatever archive you found them. And yeah, the Andy Warhol, I think it's called the Association or Archive, whatever it might be. Yes, they are, Andy Warhol, more expensive than Marcel Duchamp.
Oh, wow.
Which, you know, I guess he's worth it. But again, that was the only footage that existed of the exhibition. No, sorry, that was the only, there's images of Marcel Duchamp walking around the show. There are still photographs, which were taken by the museum's in-house photographer at the time. And then there's that Warhol footage, which is priceless and which, you know, it was beautiful. So again, thank you to Marley and KCT for making that possible and part of the film.
Hunter, the movie makes it very clear how Duchamp lives in the work of countless living artists, even if those artists don't really know who he was. And watching the nude chess scene, I immediately thought about Marina Abramovich's work, The Artist is Present. But I want to focus on a line that Duchamp says in the film, and that is, anything becomes beautiful if you look at it long enough. Not so much his influence in terms of what art is or not, but that idea and how you might see it playing out in the art world today.
I think that there's maybe some truth in that. I mean, I think we'd all think of things that we could look at long enough and it wouldn't be beautiful to us, but it's a lovely idea. I do think that the idea of taking something from actuality and having it be transformed into like a work of art is certainly the core of contemporary art today. And it's not even about looking at something long enough as much as it is like giving importance to that or sort of, I like to think of it as a kind of the artist is sort of connoisseurs of the visual world at large. They get to choose what is important to them, and then it becomes important to us. And that's terribly important in California, especially in Southern California, where it's a lot of it is not necessarily, at least from the 60s onward, much of it is rooted in media or other kinds of like more popular culture sources.
This is a question, I think, for Hal and Hunter. If Duchamp hadn't come to Pasadena, would his impact on LA artists been as profound? Because it wasn't like Ed Ruscha or John Baldessari or Robert Erdwin could download his work on the internet because it didn't exist. So that trip, in terms of their being present for it, would we have the art scene in LA that we have today had that show not happened?
Yes.
I think I asked a negative, so
No,
is that
no,
a...
Yeah.
There's a circuit you have to understand. One of the reasons that conceptual art could exist was there was a art world outside of galleries and museums, which consisted of artists going for 2 weeks to another art school and giving a spiel and showing their work and everything. And they did this for so long that they said, well, why don't we just do that, and not have to store all these paintings and things? So there got to be a Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and, a little circuit, Art Institute Chicago, where artists would go from one to another and create an intellectual art world. And then they had these little funky publications on newsprint of conceptual art. They wanted to make them as plain as possible, so only the ideas would come through. They weren't, beautiful books themselves, but just ideas. So that was going on. I mean, Duchamp certainly helped, and Walter certainly helped, but it was on its way because of this way that art was disseminated through conceptual art.
Hunter?
I think that the art world, of course, would have existed this art world would have existed. What's also important about that moment is how many people from outside LA come to see these people. And then then many of these artists go on to almost immediately have shows in New York. And that's where they become popularized, because at that time, New York was the market center of this country. And these artists look very fresh to them. These people working here were absolutely extraordinary. And I think New York dealers and museum curators and collectors were like, fine, we take it seriously. We take it seriously. We lend our endorsement to it.
Hal,
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, and I think, part of what Hunter's talking about, the fact that by chance Andy Warhol was in town.
Yes.
That opened the door, because then he meets them all, they start talking, and that creates this dialogue, this discourse. And then when they go to New York, they go hang out. Larry
Right.
Bell, it's not in the film, but he told this great anecdote about going and visiting New York, and who does he know? He calls up Andy Warhol and stays with him. And so then suddenly, again, and Randy said in the film, it provides legitimacy and credence to the fact that these artists, these people who were at the show were for real.
Which has nothing to do with the quality of the work, by the way.
Right.
Yeah, that's the art world and the machinations of the art world. It has nothing to do with the actual quality of what's being made.
Is there an argument that Duchamp was Andy Warhol before Andy Warhol was Andy Warhol? I'm totally serious.
Oh, I certainly think Andy Warhol was aware of Marcel Duchamp's work. Yeah.
No, I know that, but how profoundly did it influence his
There was
work?
a few steps in between, I think.
Okay. Hal, I was having dinner over the weekend with a family friend who's a curator at the Huntington Library Art Museum and Botanical Gardens, and she's working on a show that doesn't open until 2026. Yes, that's 4 years away, and the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
And we talked about how quickly this show came together, and I'm wondering, in a way, if walls are being constructed overnight, if it's all kind of seat of your pants, did that actually help the show in a way that, given more time, it might not have had the feel that it had, that when necessity is the mother of invention, you put together a show that feels organic and not constructed?
Well, the practical thing is that the last 10% of the work takes 90% of the time. All the reproofing and doing all these kind of things, that takes really a lot of time. So if you're Walter Hopps, you don't do any of that. It's not a half-assed job, but it's just you push through a lot of things way beyond the time that's possible, so you get more done that way. Not that you're cutting corners, but you're just. I got to tell you about a meeting.
Sure, please.
We're setting up a schedule every year. Actually, Walter didn't think about what he was going to show the next year till Bill Wilson says, "Hey, we're running our fall schedule. Can you tell me what you're doing?" Then he'd have a meeting with us in the museum.
And Bill Wilson is writing for the Times at this point. He's the art critic of the LA
Me
Times.
too. I used to do the same thing. Think of
It's okay.
God, I got to have a show by next week. But anyway, he he sat down with us, and he says we could get this Jasper Johns show because it's being done in Venice, and they could ship it back here and everything. But we don't have the time. So the shows used to open on Thursday. That was the night to have the openings, and it would close Sunday. So Sunday, a week would go by, and then a half a week. So it was a week and a half. So Walter says, if we have 6 shows, and we close Sunday and open Thursday that week, we would have enough weeks to have the Jasper Johns show. And we all said, well, okay. That means Sunday night we had to take the show down. Monday we had to pack it. Monday night Walter would come and say he wanted walls and this painted and that painted. And Tuesday we'd hang the show, and Wednesday we would put the labels up and have the opening. And we used to do, these were nonstop, sleep in the patio on the stone benches for 15 minutes.
And I don't know if you noticed in the film, Hal doesn't actually mention going to the opening.
I crashed immediately after.
You missed your own party.
Exactly, you miss your own party.
I don't blame you. Randy, I'm going to read a section from I Used to Be Charming, the rest of Eve Babitz, where she talks about, this is the essay, I Was a Naked Pawn for Art. I'm going to read a brief excerpt from this and we'll talk about it. The public opening was very crowded and lots of fun. I got myself some red wine and wandered over to a raised platform where Marcel and Walter were playing chess, and my father came by and watched with a cynical expression. He told me later, that Marcel is not very good. I could have beaten him on the 4th move, and your friend Walter can't play at all. Maybe it was the spectacle of Walter playing chess with Duchamp for art that gave Julian the idea. After all, by 1963, it had been about 40 years since Marcel had retired to play chess, or so he wanted the world to think. For 40 years, someone could have come up with the idea of photographing the master of nude descending a staircase playing chess with a naked woman, but nobody in Paris or New York thought it up. Hey, Eve, Julian said, grinning, why don't I take a picture of you nude playing chess with Marcel Duchamp? Heretofore, the only nudes in LA were calendar girls, starlets trying to make the rent. Of course, me being the nude sort of made me feel like I was pretending I was way bolder than I really was. But then anything seemed possible for art that night, especially after all that red wine. Still, this was Pasadena, the home of gracious ladies painting watercolors on afternoon outings. So I said, you better ask people, Julian, and make sure it's okay. She is 17 at the time?
Oh, she's 20.
She's 20. You're
Yes,
17.
I'm 17.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about what you remember from that period and that evening?
Yes, well, okay, yeah, I went with her to the second show because I went to the first one, which she didn't get to go to, and she was very pissed off about it. So we went together with the family, and I think that there's a lot of, there's photos of our parents also at the exhibit because they were there, and my father was really watching Marcel play chess disapprovingly. And but when we came home and we talked about...
Wait, I want to make sure. He's watching how he's playing chess, not the person sitting opposite him? Or is there...
No, both of them.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
make
yeah,
sure.
Yeah, the
Okay.
whole scenario. Yeah, he was a chess player himself. And so we went home and we went to talk to Eve about, what she was going to do. And, she was very kind of like, well, can I do this? Is it okay? And she had earlier, she had even asked, who was Duchamp, because we didn't really know who Duchamp was, and my father, who had friends on the scene, said, well, he's the Dada of Dada. So there, yeah. And so we had this, but Eve was going to have to be entirely naked. And she said that, we talked about it, and she said, that she wanted to do it. And she really wanted to get back at Walter for not inviting her. And that was really the whole thing. She kind of misunderstood why I think he had not disinvited her, but she had hung up on him on the phone about a week beforehand, and she thought he didn't want her there, but I think, he hadn't actually said that. So there's a question there.
And I read that that he didn't hang up on her, or they actually got to speak more after the fact, after that happened.
Oh, they spoke quite a lot. Yeah.
David, I think people who live in Pasadena might recognize what became of the building that Duchamp show was staged. It's now known as the USC Pacific Asia Museum, correct?
That's right, yeah.
But I want to ask more specifically about the legacy in Pasadena. There's a very brief reference to the Pasadena Art Alliance and its founding of the Pasadena Art Museum that you might know better as the Norton Simon Museum. So Hunter, anybody else, David, you can talk about this, about what happens next in Pasadena art.
Right. Well, and Hunter, she is our resident expert, but, and so please, feel free to respond. But essentially, Walter Hopps in 1965 leaves the Pasadena Art Museum, and simultaneously the new management decides to try and raise money to build a new building. They don't have the money, essentially.
Actually, the contemporary art, this show, in a nutshell, obviously this is a potted history of sorts, is so exciting to collectors, nascent collectors, people who are interested in collecting contemporary art, that they decide, in fact, they do need more support for their contemporary art. The Pasadena Art Museum, they raised money, they decided to build a new building on a city-owned lot, and they hire an architect, and they spend too much money, as museum developers always do, and boards of trustees always do. But they opened this museum, and there was such goodwill toward the Pasadena Art Museum that many artists, not just artists in LA like Larry Bell or Ed Ruscha, but Eddie Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, they donated works of art to this museum to form their core collection, which survived. So the museum has survived a few years, but they were constantly running out. They didn't have enough money. They didn't have enough money to support it. They didn't know how to make an endowment that would support the museum long term. They were going to have to file for bankruptcy. What would happen to the collection? A lot of confusion. And in steps Norton Simon, who is, of course, excellent at mergers and acquisitions and taking over distressed properties. And he basically buys the building and the collection and bails out the debt, and that is today the Norton Simon Museum. So if you go into the Norton Simon Museum, you're actually in the building that used to be the Pasadena Museum of Contemporary Art. But just to remember that the Pasadena Art Museum, when you do the history of it, it's not just the Duchamp show. The shows there were extraordinary. It's really quite an amazing thing, and it is due to the women of Pasadena and men who were very supportive of that time. And it's a good message to boards, future trustees, and museum supporters everywhere.
I have the most literate mail carrier in the world. His name is Tim Pacheco, and he's also a very loyal KPCC listener. Regrettably, he couldn't make it tonight, but he came by my house and said, I have a Duchamp story I have to tell you. And when a mail carrier tells you that, you say, what's the story? The condensed version is that he and his wife were living at the Castle Green in the early aughts, and they were coordinating weddings in the building. And the Pasadena Fire Department demanded that if they wanted to continue to stage events there, they needed to retrofit the entire building with sprinklers. So they had a meeting of the HOA, and they realized they didn't have enough money, and the evening was winding down, and somebody came up to Tim and said, you know how we can pay for this? we got to get that sign that Dennis Hopper stole from the property and Duchamp signed. Because it's got to be worth something. That's what he told Tim. And Hunter, I think you can say something more about this looted piece of art, because I was on the Christie's website where it was auctioned, and there's no mention of its provenance, that it was actually boosted by Dennis Hopper from the Castle Green. So what happened to we saw that it sold. Where is it now?
Well, this is one of the high points of my life. That my book was published in 2011, and I get a phone call from Leonard Riggio, who founded Barnes & Noble, who had seen this book in his bookstore and picked it up and read it on a plane and called me to tell me that he, in fact, had bought that sign at auction. And as far as I know, he still owns it.
I'm glad it's doing better than its book chain.
And maybe he doesn't still own it.
Here is my last question, and we'll have time for some audience question. We talked a lot about how Duchamp affected other artists and his impact on LA through this show. I want to ask you about how he affected you, what you carried forward from that show, how it affected the way you thought about art, about Los Angeles, about Duchamp, about anything. So, Hunter, I'm going to start with you and work my way back to me.
What will Al and Miranda talk, and then work your way back
Okay.
to me? Because I think Hal, it had a huge impact on
Okay,
Hal's
sure.
life. And
Randy,
Hal,
why don't you start?
Okay.
Well, I think it really, really impacted my feeling about the whole scene and about the people, the artists that were there, and Duchamp's art, and the idea of conceptual art, as a thing that was, going to go from him to these people that I knew and whose shows I was going to. So it really, did ground me in that way.
Hal?
Yeah.
So it's important to me because Duchamp was interested in perception, and it's not so visible in the work. But there was a thing that looked like a big propeller made out of glass that was supposed to turn and create optical effects along with the rotoreliefs. I was in the same room with the rotoreliefs. And we couldn't get a motor for it. It had been reproduced by Pontus Hulton for the Moderna Museum. And they put a 220-volt motor on it, and we didn't know. And anyway, so Duchamp turned it by hand for us to see how fast it was supposed to go. And I got to see it operating, and it didn't operate during the show. So that was amazing. And then we were up till 3 a.m. Finishing the roto-reliefs. And we just sat there, zoomed out and looked. And Walter came in, and we wouldn't go back to work. We were just watching roto-reliefs. It was amazing, really.
Which means that he was interested in how his things looked, how they functioned.
Yes.
It wasn't just an idea for Duchamp. I mean, they were poetical objects. There's no doubt about that for him. And in terms of LA, yeah, I think that you could say, people have said, I will say, that there has always been an extremely strong conceptual art force within the Los Angeles community since 1960, which does not say that 63, not to say that there aren't also fantastic people who do paintings and realist paintings and abstract paintings, but there has been a strong, strong conceptual art movement here, and obviously that's a big place, had a big place at Cal Arts, and then a big place at Art Center, and so I don't know if it's not linearly tied, but certainly that's a good launching pad for it. And since this is film, I wanted to mention to you that do you remember that Andy Warhol made, I think, one of his first films right here. He came here with his movie camera and made films, and he included Dennis Hopper, and he included many of the artists in that film, and called it Tarzan and Jane and something else based on the fact that he'd driven through Tarzana or knew about Tarzana, which of course is where Tarzan comes from, in case you don't know, which I'm sure you do. But I thought that people are always talking about how Andy influenced L.A., and I always want to go back. Actually, L.A. had a big influence on Andy, and those first real prints are Troy Donahue and Marilyn Monroe and Liz Taylor, and let's remember where he came before he started thinking along those lines.
David, any last words before we take some audience questions?
No, I just think, one of the pleasures of this project was being able to spend time with Duchamp and his words and his thoughts. And, I I mean, they still work. They still resonate, and they still. I mean, I just watched it now, and I listen again, I mean, these ideas of the spectator helps make the work, and the work is is just about choice. Those kinds of things. I mean, for myself as an artist and a creator, they still are inspirational and motivational, and there's just, it's amazing that it still works. The one thing I would like to, just the anecdote that Morandi should tell. The other thing that is not in the film, but the photograph of your sister didn't make it out into the wild.
Oh no!
For a long time.
No, it did not.
So,
I know people have the impression that it launched, Eve, or it launched anything, but it didn't really. It just went. It didn't even get into the Times. I think that they didn't run it. They didn't run any of that.
Yeah.
Because it was considered obscene?
No, they just,
Indecent?
They
just
didn't think that the
overlooked it.
event was important enough to include the photographs. I'm sure that
my
the
goodness.
obscenity probably was
didn't help.
pushed it
Yeah.
off the fact. But yeah. But so when did the photograph come out?
I think it started to appear. You know this, Hunter, right? When did it actually
That's what
start
I was
to
actually
appear?
thinking the same thing. I was trying to remember. It's also permanently in my mind. I don't know when it first appeared.
Somebody in the 70s,
Uh-huh.
and I want to say it was a rock musician, artist. Somebody had a copy of the photograph.
Oh, yeah. You know who had it was, Earl McGrath. Right.
That would make sense.
Almost a rock
Wow.
star. Yes.
It came out day and date.
And he had it up on his wall, and people like Ahmet Ertegun were hanging out there, so it was kind of a very, and Joan Didion, those people. So,
Wow.
and it was kind of as Eve was starting to write. So it became, but they had it, but I don't think it really got out after,
Not that widely published, and then
No.
of course
and Julian just hates that.
Of course. If anybody has a question, put up your hand. Rebecca didn't say this at the beginning. The doors are locked until everybody is pledged. So
Oh, yeah. You're
it
not
might be a long
leaving.
night. Yes, right up here. I think we have a mic coming around. So hang on a second. We'll try to get 3 questions. I think our panel will be around afterward. So
I think we should have a little bit of discussion about the influence of Walter Aronson.
Okay,
And Walter Hopps.
I'll talk
Okay.
about that because that's not actually in the movie because we couldn't, and with quite rightly, you can only do so much in 15 minutes. David Grabias did a fantastic job, by the way, of telling this incredibly complex story. And I didn't make his job any easier by giving him every possible digression known to a director, producer. But yes, the Ahrensburg collection is hugely important. The answer for everybody who doesn't know, why is Marcel Duchamp ever in Pasadena? Well, it starts because his foremost collectors in New York City were Walter and Louise Ahrensburg, who had moved to Hollywood in 1927 and whose house on Hillside Avenue is still there, bringing with them their collection of Man Ray and Miro and Brancusi and Duchamp. They were the huge collectors of Duchamp, and not only that, Duchamp became their dealer of sorts, their agent to help them get the works of art that they wanted. And then in advance of World War II, they provided the visa that allowed him to come to New York City to live. He came to Pasadena to visit them in 1936, 1949, again in 1950, and together they all tried to get the Ahrensburg collection with all these Duchamps to go to UCLA. And Hal showed me a great story earlier. Apparently this collection did go to UCLA, and there were provisions that they had that UCLA was not able to live up to. The collection all goes to Philadelphia, where the largest collection of Duchamp material is today. But all of this is really due to the fact that Louise and Walter Ahrensburg lived in Hollywood, and that's how Duchamp was coming to LA at all.
a couple more questions. Right here, and then we'll take here and then there. Wait for the mic. It's coming up. Yeah, but we're recording this, so it might help. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm curious if maybe there might be an opportunity for the guys that are still alive here in LA that were in the big LA gang happening then with Kienholz and Richer and those guys. Is there any plan to maybe move forward and do another documentary like this?
About that group of artists specifically?
Yeah.
Well, it's been done. There's a film called The Cool School, which is, maybe 15, 20 years old, which is a great piece where he brings together all those Fearless Gallery artists and kind of tells that story, which I highly recommend. It's well done.
There you go. It's already made. And last question back here.
Yeah, in one of the quotes you had, I'm going to paraphrase it, there was something about an artist can scream from the balconies that he's the greatest, but until he finds an audience, they can't really back that up. How much of art is self-promotion, and or is there art that is out there that's great that we don't hear about it because the artist is so bad at promoting themselves?
I'll let the curator
Yeah.
answer
We
that
could
question.
be here all night, but what's the short answer to that? Yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's actually the most astute, it's a very astute quote. I mean, actually, I do believe that the cream rises. Let's leave it at that.
Hal, what would you say? I mean, as a curator,
No, it's very interesting because
Mic up.
there is some artists where ambition and talent really work together. Andy Warhol, Kienholz, they do all these tricks and but that's very rare. But it's good when it happens because it accelerates the creating of the art, really.
I'm going to end with one story. When I was in college in the early 80s, I'll date myself, Pasadena Art Alliance used to get a lot of local artists to donate work, and they auction it off to fund their art endeavors. And there was an auction. I was really struck by a painting. It was about maybe 2 feet by 24 inches by 18 inches. Really moved me. The minimum price was $750. And I was in college. I didn't have a lot of money. This painting's really speaking to me. And I just couldn't rationalize the $750. And I called the Art Alliance the next day and I said, what did it go for? And they said they never got the minimum bid. And about 2-3 years ago, I asked a friend of mine who's a collector how much that painting would be worth. And he said, that Jasper John's about $12 million today. I kid you not. I guess maybe I wouldn't be working in public radio. Who knows? But anyway, next time you're at an auction and a painting speaks to you, buy it. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank you all for coming out. Have a great evening.